A pitch-black field under a sky heavy with gray clouds. The wind howled fiercely, kicking up a haze of dust. Ethan stood facing Rachel, his eyes burning with fury, while she met his gaze with a calm, unreadable expression. The shrieking wind sliced through the air, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Ethan clenched the paper in his hand, his voice choked yet filled with rage. Is that it? Just a deal? My father bought you with money, and you accepted it without saying a word to me? Rachel took a step toward him, her voice low but steady. Do you think I had a choice? This farm is all I have. My family is on the brink of collapse. I had to do it, and I have no regrets. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, a cold, cutting smile playing on his lips as the wind whipped against his face. No regrets? Have you thought about how I feel? Do you think everything can just go back to normal after I find out the truth? Rachel drew in a deep breath, her gaze sharp as a blade. I don't expect you to understand. But you have to know I didn't do this to use you, I did it to save my family. The wind howled louder, and a flash of lightning split the sky. Ethan turned away, walking off into the darkness, leaving Rachel standing there. Her eyes shimmered with a mixture of regret and pain. The audience could see Rachel clenching her fist, a single tear rolling down her cheek, but she didn't call out to him. This isn't the end, it's only the beginning of an unexpected truth. Will Ethan return to face Rachel, or will he leave everything behind forever? Hit subscribe now to join us on this emotional journey and see where the story goes. The answer awaits you ahead. James Parker's office resembled a fortress, with glossy oak wood walls and a meticulously arranged desk radiating power and control. The large window behind him framed a view of Austin, the city's shimmering lights embodying wealth and ambition. Yet, inside the room, the air was thick with tension, suffocating in its intensity. Ethan Parker sat slouched in a leather chair, one leg crossed over the other, his posture sharp, much like the suit he wore. He twirled a car key on his finger, the metallic clink the only sound breaking the silence. Are you even listening to me, Ethan? James' voice was cold, controlled, slicing through the room like a blade. Every week, another tabloid headline, another police call. How much longer do you plan on clinging to my name before you ruin everything I've built? Ethan smirked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Let me guess, Dad, you're about to go into your I worked hard for this speech, right? Spare me, I've heard it all before. James slammed his hand down on the desk, the force of it causing Ethan to flinch, enough to feel the weight of the tension in the room. James' voice echoed, reverberating off the walls. This isn't a lecture. This is a punishment. Ethan leaned back, trying to mask the rising anxiety within him. Punishment? That seems a bit much, even for you. James stood, towering over his son, his gray eyes icy, piercing straight through Ethan. You've left me no choice. You've wasted every opportunity I've given you. Do you think life's a game? Parties, women, cars, and when it all falls apart, you expect me to clean up the mess? Not anymore. Ethan straightened, the smirk fading from his face. What the hell are you talking about? James walked around the desk, each step deliberate, his tone unwavering. I'm saying your time as a spoiled, irresponsible child is over. You have everything, and yet you've done nothing to earn it. That ends now. Ethan scoffed, a sense of superiority creeping back into his voice. Are you cutting me off? No trust fund, no inheritance, nothing? Fine, I'll manage. I have friends, connections. James interrupted, his voice cold, lower now, each word heavy with finality. No money, no credit cards, no safety net, until you prove you're capable of more than being a leech. Ethan felt the floor shift beneath him. His father's calm tone laced with a finality that made his chest tighten. Prove what? How the hell am I supposed to prove that? James paused, letting the silence settle like a vice between them before he spoke, with the precision of a strategist. You're going to Tennessee. Ethan blinked, confused. Tennessee? What the hell's in Tennessee? The farm, James answered simply, his tone unyielding. And a woman named Rachel Thompson. Ethan burst out laughing in disbelief, shaking his head. This is a joke, right? A farm? What do you want me to do? Shovel manure, milk cows? You'll do whatever it takes to make that farm run, James replied, his face unreadable. And you will marry Rachel. The room went silent. Ethan stared at his father, his mind struggling to process the absurdity of what he had just heard. Then he laughed again, louder this time, as if the ridiculousness of the statement were the punchline of a cruel joke. You've lost your mind, old man. Marry a farmer? Are you hearing yourself? James' gaze grew colder, his words like steel. This isn't up for negotiation. Ethan sprang up from the chair, fury igniting inside him, his body tense with anger. You can't force me to marry some random woman just because you're pissed at me. I can, James said, his voice calm but firm, carrying an undeniable weight. And I will. If you refuse, you'll be completely cut off. No money, no favors. You'll be out, Ethan. And trust me, your friends won't stick around when they realize you've got nothing left to offer them. Ethan clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides, his muscles tensing as each word his father spoke pierced him like a dagger. You're insane, he spat. You finally lost it. James stepped closer, his presence looming over Ethan like a shadow. No, Ethan. I'm saving you from yourself. You think life is about excess and indulgence, but real life, real success, is built on resilience, sacrifice, and responsibility. And until you learn that, you're no longer my son. Ethan felt his father's words land like a punch to the face, the contempt in his voice sinking deep into Ethan's soul, more painful than anything he could admit. He wanted to scream, to fight back, to storm out of the office and never look back, but James' gaze stopped him. There was no room for negotiation, no trace of the man who had bailed him out time and again. This was real, and then there was Rachel. Who is Rachel? Ethan finally asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Is she just some desperate farmer who thinks marrying me is her ticket out of poverty? Rachel Thompson doesn't need you, James interjected sharply. She needs help saving her family's farm, and she's willing to work for it, something you'll need to learn to do. Ethan sneered, his tone mocking. So you're punishing her, pushing her into this farce? James' expression softened, just for a split second, but it was enough to be noticed. Rachel knows exactly what's at stake. She agreed because she believes in what she's fighting for. Can you say the same? Ethan fell silent, his mind reeling. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but he saw it in his father's eyes. There was no winning this battle. James Parker had made his decision, and the rules were set. When do I leave? Ethan asked, his voice hollow. James gave a small, reluctant smile, the barest trace of courtesy. In 2 days. Pack light. You won't need much. Ethan turned and walked toward the door, each step stiff, his mind spinning with anger and disbelief. Just as he reached for the door handle, James' voice stopped him. Ethan. He turned back, his eyes sharp as knives. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can charm your way out of this, James said, his voice cold, but there was something deeper in his eyes, something Ethan had never seen before. This isn't about me controlling you. This is your chance to find yourself. Don't waste it. Ethan's throat tightened, but he didn't respond. He walked out of the office, slamming the door behind him. As he strode down the marble hallway, his mind was in chaos, the words of his father repeating like a broken record. Tennessee, a farm, a woman he'd never met, and his father's ridiculous punishment echoing in his head, each passing mile making the absurdity of it all clearer. Ethan glanced at the GPS, the robotic voice announcing that he was 20 minutes away from the Riverside farm. 20 more minutes, and he would be somewhere unknown, somewhere he didn't know what to expect. He snorted, muttering under his breath. Insane. His voice echoed in the empty car, but his thoughts were interrupted as the smooth ride jolted over a pothole. He cursed, his sharp eyes scanning the dirt road ahead. The gravel crunched under the tires, dust rising to form a fog in the rearview mirror, like a mocking reminder. The surroundings were entirely different from anything he knew, simple, raw, and suffocating in its silence. He pulled out his phone, checking for missed calls or messages, but there was nothing, just the silence mocking him. There was no escape, not for now. As the GPS signaled his arrival, Ethan's eyes landed on the distant farmhouse. His chest tightened. It wasn't anything like he imagined. The house was humble, the white paint peeling and faded, the porch sagging as if time had worn it down. The barn stood tall but battered, its red paint chipped to reveal the rough wood beneath. A row of trees stretched behind the property, swaying gently in the breeze. It looked like a beautiful painting, if not for the crushing reality that weighed on him, making it all too difficult to bear. He stopped the car in front of the house, and the door creaked open. There she was, Rachel Thompson. Ethan froze, his hand hovering over the door handle, not daring to open it. She didn't look anything like he expected. Standing tall and confident, with a slender but strong frame, she seemed as much a part of the land as the earth beneath her feet. Her hair was neatly braided, and her jeans and flannel shirt were stained with dirt, clear signs of someone who worked hard with her hands. But it was her gaze that held Ethan back, sharp, assessing, unimpressed. She crossed her arms, leaning against the porch railing as he finally stepped out of the car. Her eyes swept over him, taking in his designer suit and shiny shoes, a small smirk playing at the corner of her lips. "You must be Ethan Parker," she said, her voice flat, tinged with skepticism. Ethan adjusted his jacket, trying to keep his composure. "And you must be Rachel," he replied, his tone wavering between arrogance and discomfort. She raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You're late." He blinked, taken aback by her bluntness. "I didn't realize there was a schedule." "There's always a schedule on a farm," she shot back, pushing herself off the railing. Her footsteps rang out on the wooden porch as she descended the stairs, each step purposeful, strong. "Work doesn't wait for anyone, especially not you." Ethan felt judged, his body tightening under the weight of her words. "Look, I'm not interested in this deal either," he retorted. "So let's skip the lectures and get this over with." Rachel stopped a few steps away, her eyes sharp as knives. "Get this over with?" she repeated, her voice. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ethan." For the first time since arriving here, Ethan felt a slight sense of relief. He shook her hand, gripping it firmly, unexpectedly. "It's a pleasure to meet you too." Betty smiled lightly, waving away the formality. "Just call me Betty. Please come in. I'm sure you're tired after your long journey." Ethan hesitated but eventually followed her up the stairs, with Rachel trailing behind. Inside the small but cozy farmhouse, it had the kind of charm that made it feel alive. The scent of freshly baked bread lingered in the air, and mismatched furniture added a touch of grace. It was a stark contrast to the cold, modern spaces Ethan was accustomed to, but there was something about it that made him feel strangely at ease. Betty pointed toward the kitchen table, where a pitcher of lemonade and a plate of cookies had already been prepared. Ethan sat up straight, unsure how to navigate this unfamiliar world. Rachel leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her gaze never leaving him. Betty began to speak, sitting across from him. "I imagine this is quite a change for you," she said. Ethan forced a smile, but it was strained, unnatural. "I suppose you could say that," he replied. Betty nodded, her eyes sparkling with understanding. "We're not fancy people, but we work hard and take care of each other. You'll get used to it." Ethan didn't respond, his gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the fields stretched endlessly, their beauty overshadowed by the reality of the situation he was in. He couldn't imagine ever feeling at home here. Rachel interrupted his thoughts with a throat-clearing sound, drawing his attention. "You'll be staying in the guest room," she said, her tone clipped. "It's small but clean. Don't expect room service." Ethan furrowed his brow, her sarcasm irritating him. "I can manage," he replied coldly. Betty chuckled softly, intervening. "All right, I'll let you two handle it. I've got some things to do." She patted Rachel's arm as she passed by. "Play nice, sweetheart." Once Betty left, the air between them became tense, almost unmovable. Rachel sat up straight, her gaze sharp. "Let me make one thing clear," she said, her voice low. "I didn't ask for this any more than you did. But since you're here, you'll pull your weight. I won't be carrying the load for you." Ethan stood up, frustration building inside him, impossible to suppress. "Do you think I want to be here?" he snapped. "Do you think I chose this? Trust me, that feeling is mutual." Rachel stepped closer, her eyes burning. "But then maybe we can skip the complaints and get to work." They stood facing each other, just a few steps apart, the air thick with tension. For a moment, no one spoke, each waiting for the other to back down. Finally, Rachel turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the kitchen. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, heavy like a stone in his chest. The next morning came too soon for Ethan Parker. As the first rays of sunlight began to spread across the horizon, a sharp knock on the door roused him from sleep. He groaned, burying his head under the pillow, but the knock came again, louder this time. "Get up," Rachel's voice echoed, firm and unyielding. "Work starts at sunrise." Ethan mumbled a curse under his breath but couldn't ignore the seriousness in her tone. She wouldn't let him off easy. He sighed reluctantly, throwing his legs over the side of the bed and rubbing his face. The small living room offered no comforts to ease the discomfort of waking up. Just simple wooden furniture, a single window, and a bed that creaked with every movement. Hastily pulling on a wrinkled shirt and the jeans he hadn't worn in a while, Ethan shuffled downstairs. He found Rachel waiting in the kitchen, already dressed in worn work boots and a faded flannel shirt, a cup of coffee in hand. She didn't look up as he entered. Instead, her attention was focused on a spreadsheet filled with notes and numbers. "Good morning," Ethan mumbled, but the bitterness in his voice made it sound more like a complaint. Rachel glanced at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Eat something. You'll need it." Ethan frowned as his eyes landed on the plate of scrambled eggs and toast on the counter. He wasn't sure if this was a peace offering or just a farm routine, but he picked up the plate and sat at the table without saying a word. The eggs were overcooked, and the toast was dry, but hunger won out over his pride. Rachel set the spreadsheet down and leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "We've got a lot to do today," she said. "The irrigation line in the west field is leaking and the barn roof needs patching. Do you think you can handle a hammer?" Ethan looked up from his plate, his brows furrowing. "I went to college. I'm not useless." The corner of Rachel's mouth twitched, almost forming a smile, but she held it back. "But let's see if that college degree will help you here." Before Ethan could retort, Betty appeared in the doorway, her presence a welcome break from the building tension. "Good morning, you two," she said cheerfully, her voice warm and calm. "Perfect day to work hard, don't you think?" Ethan forced a strained smile. "If you say so." Betty patted him on the shoulder as she passed, her gesture comforting. "You'll get the hang of it, Ethan. Just give it time." He doubted that but didn't say it. Instead, he finished his breakfast and followed Rachel outside, ready for the challenges farm life would bring. The cool, fresh morning air carried the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass. The farm was bathed in the soft light of dawn, almost serene, though Ethan guessed the tranquility wouldn't last long. Rachel led the way to the west field, her steps purposeful and unhurried, while Ethan struggled to keep up, his city shoes slipping on the uneven ground. "You'll need boots," Rachel said without looking back. "Those leather shoes won't cut it." Ethan looked down at his shoes, now caked in mud, and frowned. "Thanks for the advice." They reached the edge of the field, where a tangle of pipes and hoses sprawled across the ground. Water was leaking from several spots, forming small glistening puddles in the sunlight. Rachel crouched down, examining one of the leaks with sharp eyes. "This spot's bad," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Pick up that wrench." Ethan glanced around and spotted a rusted toolbox a few steps away. He opened it, the hinges squeaking in protest, and rummaged through it until he found the tool. As he handed the wrench to Rachel, she took it without a word and began tightening the connection. "Do you even know how to do this?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Rachel glanced at him, her gaze cold. "You can't run a farm without learning a few things, Parker." He crossed his arms, watching her work with precision and efficiency. Frustration boiled within him as she seemed so at home in this world, like an inseparable part of it. He felt like an intruder, an outsider in a world he didn't understand, but he wasn't about to admit it. Suddenly, Rachel stepped aside and held out the wrench, her eyes challenging him. "Why don't you give it a try?" Ethan hesitated, eyeing the dripping pipe as though it might bite him. "Fine," he muttered, taking the wrench. He knelt down, his movements awkward and unsure. The metal was slippery in his hands, and as he tried to tighten the joint, the wrench slipped from his grasp, spraying water all over his face. Rachel fought to suppress a laugh, but the amusement in her eyes was undeniable. "Well, at least you've got enthusiasm. That's a start." Ethan wiped his face with the back of his hand, his cheeks burning with anger. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Who lives like this?" Rachel's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "People who work for what they have. People who don't have everything handed to them," she replied sharply. Her words hit him like a punch, leaving him speechless. He threw the wrench to the ground, stood up, frustration rising within him. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," she responded, her voice rising. "I know you think you're too good for this place, that you're just waiting to go back to an easy life in the city." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but the truth in her words left him silent. He turned away, his jaw clenched as he tried to hold back his anger. Rachel sighed, her voice softening, replaced by something gentler. "Look, I get it. This isn't what you want, and it's not what I want either, but we're stuck with it. So you can either make things better or make it harder for both of us." Ethan said nothing, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The vast landscape stretched out before him, a stark reminder of the distance between him and everything he knew. At that moment, he felt small, insignificant, standing before the endless sky. "All right," he finally said, his voice low, "just show me how." Rachel studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether he was serious, then nodded. "All right, let's try again." The morning passed in a blur of trial and error, Ethan fumbling through the leaks and moving heavy equipment. His body protested every unfamiliar movement, each step draining him more. By the time the work was done, his clothes were soaked, his muscles ached, and his patience was nearly spent. But the leaks were fixed, and for the first time, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. They walked back to the house in silence, the tension between them easing a little as they neared the porch. Betty appeared, holding a glass of iced tea, her warm smile glowing with satisfaction. "Looks like you survived your first morning," she said, handing Ethan a glass. He took it gratefully, the cold liquid a relief. "Just about," he muttered, though there was a touch of humor in his voice. Betty chuckled softly. "You'll get used to it, just give it time." Ethan glanced at Rachel, who was leaning against the porch railing, her expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met, and he thought he saw something in her gaze. A feeling, something more than just disdain, but before Ethan could figure it out, Rachel turned away and disappeared into the house without a word. As Ethan sat on the porch, sipping his tea and looking out at the fields, he felt the weight of the entire day pressing down on him. This life, this place, was so foreign, so challenging, and nothing like he had expected. But as the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the fields, he couldn't help but wonder if there was something here worth fighting for. The harsh afternoon sun refused to relent, beating down on the fields with such intensity that every breath seemed heavy. Ethan stood in the middle of the field, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes fixed on the tall barn roof. His shirt clung to his back, drenched and uncomfortable, as he squinted at the missing shingles Rachel had pointed out earlier. "You're afraid of heights, aren't you?" Rachel's voice came from behind, sharp and teasing, cutting through the thick air. Ethan turned, forcing a grin. "I'm not afraid of heights. I'm just cautious." Rachel raised an eyebrow, her eyes full of skepticism as she handed him a toolbox. "Cautious? Well, if you don't want the rain to flood the barn when the storm hits, you'll have to climb up there." He glanced at the ladder leaning against the roof, each rung looking thinner and less trustworthy. "This isn't exactly the safest ladder," he muttered. Rachel rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "You'll be fine, just don't look down." Ethan muttered something under his breath before grabbing the toolbox and heading toward the ladder. The first step creaked ominously under his weight, and for a brief moment he considered giving up entirely. But then he saw Rachel watching him, her lips curling up in a suppressed smile. He didn't want to let her see him back down so easily. He climbed slowly, his hands turning white as he gripped the sides of the ladder. When he finally reached the roof, his heart was pounding in his chest. "See? No problem," he called down, though his voice lacked conviction. "Sure," Rachel replied, amusement clear in her tone. "Just don't fall, I don't want to have to carry you to the hospital." Ethan rolled his eyes but didn't respond. Instead, he focused on the task, taking a handful of shingles from the toolbox and placing them on the roof. The roof was scorching under his hands, the heat radiating through to his skin as he nailed each shingle into place with more force than he thought necessary. Rachel stood below, watching him with a critical eye. "You missed a spot on the left," she called up after a few minutes. Ethan stopped, turning to look. "Maybe you should come up here and do it if you're such an expert." Rachel smiled. "I would, but watching you struggle is more fun." Ethan grumbled something under his breath and shifted his position, making the shingles beneath him groan. His stomach tightened as the edge of the roof seemed to draw closer, the ground below taunting him with its unreachable distance. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus, one nail at a time. When he finally climbed down, his entire body was tense, exhausted. Ethan's legs felt like jelly, but the repairs were done. Rachel inspected his work, nodding once in approval. "Not bad, Parker. I'm almost impressed," she said, her tone teasing. Ethan responded quickly, brushing the dust off his jeans. "What does it take to really impress you?" Rachel's smile slowly faded, her gaze lingering on him just a little longer than usual. "You'll know if that ever happens," she replied, her voice soft yet sharp in a way Ethan couldn't quite place. Before he could say anything else, Betty appeared around the corner of the barn, her face full of concern. "Rachel," she called urgently, her voice frantic. "The irrigation pipes on the east field are clogged, the water's pooling on the rows of plants." Rachel immediately straightened, her expression hardening. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that we need to deal with it now," Betty answered, her gaze briefly flicking to Ethan before softening. "Maybe you should bring him along. We could use an extra pair of hands." Rachel hesitated, looking at Ethan. He raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Afraid I'll slow you down?" The tension in Rachel's face was more evident now. "Try not to break anything," she replied firmly. The two of them made their way to the east field, the air thick with tension as they approached the rows of plants. Ethan spotted the problem immediately. Water had gathered in large puddles, flooding the soil and threatening the roots. A pile of debris was blocking the irrigation pipe, stopping the water from flowing. Without hesitation, Rachel dropped to her knees, swiftly pulling the dirt and leaves away with practiced movements. Ethan followed suit, though the muddy water made his stomach churn. "This won't fix itself," Rachel said, her voice serious, cutting through the silence. "Dig, Ethan." He struggled to suppress a growl, grabbing the rake nearby and using it to scrape away the debris. The work was exhausting, mud clinging to his hands and clothes as the sun beat down mercilessly. Sweat beaded on his forehead, trickling into his eyes, but he didn't stop. Pride urged him on. "How did this happen?" he asked, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "Flood waters from the storm and the animals," Rachel replied without looking up. "You choose." Ethan gritted his teeth, frustration surging inside him. "Ridiculous. There has to be an easier way to do this." Rachel lifted her head, her eyes sharp. "If there was an easier way, what do you think I'd be doing? This is what needs to be done to keep the farm running. Hard work, something you obviously know nothing about." Her words stung, but he didn't respond. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, his movements becoming more deliberate. Time passed, the two of them working in silence as the trench slowly cleared. Finally, when the water began to flow again, Rachel sighed in relief, sitting back on her heels. "That's done," she said, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Ethan dropped the rake, his arms weary, his body soaked in mud and sweat. "Glad you know how to say thank you," he said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Rachel's lips twitched, but she didn't smile. "Don't get used to it." They walked back to the house, the the sun dipping below the horizon, long shadows stretching across the fields. The air had grown cooler, the soft golden light easing the heat of the day. Betty was waiting for them on the porch, her expression calm, as if she were offering silent praise. "Of you did well," she said briefly, her gaze lingering on Ethan longer than he expected. He nodded, too tired to reply, leaning against the porch railing, feeling the weight of the day settle on him like a heavy blanket. His body ached in ways he had never known, but beneath the exhaustion, there was a strange sense of accomplishment rising up within him. Rachel stood a few paces away, arms crossed, gazing out at the fields. The tension between them seemed to have lessened, even if only a little, and for the first time, Ethan wondered what life would be like with her, carrying this burden every day. "You're not as useless as I thought," she suddenly broke the silence. Ethan turned to look at her, his brow furrowed. "Is that a compliment?" "Don't get cocky," she replied, but there was a warmth in her voice he hadn't heard before. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ethan felt a strange, indescribable sensation rise within him. Life here was hard, unforgiving, and far from what he had imagined, but for the first time he wondered if it might just be what he needed. The air grew heavy with the threat of a storm, dark clouds gathering on the horizon, their edges sharp and fierce, stretching across the sky like a warning. Ethan stood beside the barn, his hands on his hips, staring at the looming, gray mass of clouds. Though he wasn't familiar with rural life, he could tell this storm would be severe. Rachel approached from the house, her boots kicking up small puffs of dust. Her face was tense, her eyes flicking between the sky and the barn. "We don't have much time," she said briefly, "no small talk. The storm's going to hit hard, and we need to protect the livestock." Ethan turned to her, the unease in his chest growing stronger. "How bad is it going to be?" "Bad enough," she replied, her tone sharp. "Wind, rain, maybe hail. If we don't prepare in time, we could lose the cattle, or worse." He swallowed hard, nodding. "Okay, what do I need to do?" Rachel hesitated for a moment, her piercing gaze studying him, then she tossed him a pair of gloves. "Start with the horses. They'll be the hardest to calm. Betty's inside, so it's just us out here." Ethan caught the gloves, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. There was no room for mistakes, no chance for error, not tonight. The barn seemed to hum with anxious energy, the horses neighing and stomping their hooves. The sound of hooves echoed, their nervous cries filling the air, intensifying the tension in the barn. Ethan moved toward the first stall, his hands steady but his heart racing faster than ever. The mare inside lifted her head, her nostrils flaring as if sensing something, the distant rumble of thunder filling the space. "Take it slow," he whispered, his voice soft and calm. "Hey girl, it's just a little storm." Rachel was on the other side of the stall, her movements quick and efficient as she locked the door and checked the latch. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Keep your voice steady, they can sense when you're anxious." "Thanks for the advice," Ethan replied, his eyes fixed on the mare. He reached out, his fingers grazing the leather strap. The mare jerked her head, nearly throwing him off balance, but he held firm. Rachel's voice cut through the tension, strong and commanding. "Don't let her push you, show her who's in control." Ethan gritted his teeth, stepping closer. He grabbed the strap again, this time with more confidence, and draped it over the mare's head. She snorted, her body shifting restlessly, but she didn't bolt. Ethan exhaled slowly, a small victory swelling in his chest. "Got it," he called over to Rachel. "Good," she replied, her voice a little gentler, but still matter-of-fact. "Now, take her to the back stall, it's safer there." Ethan led the mare carefully, each step cautious. The storm outside was growing closer, the wind howling through the cracks in the barn. The air seemed to vibrate with tension, the storm making his hair stand on end. When he tied the horse to the back stall, a loud crash sounded from outside, followed by the torrential downpour, the rain battering the roof like thunder, drowning out all other sounds. Ethan turned to Rachel, who was securing the food room door. "We're not going to get blown away, are we?" he asked, half joking, half serious. Rachel shot him a look, her expression annoyed. As long as we stay focused, we'll be fine. The barn door slammed open, the wind tearing through like a living creature. Ethan shielded his face from the debris, his heart racing when he realized a cow had escaped the pen. The animal charged through the barn, its frantic bellowing lost in the roaring wind. "Rachel!" he shouted, his voice nearly lost in the storm. She saw it too, her eyes widening. "Stay here," she yelled, then ran toward the door. "No way I'm staying here!" Ethan shouted back, chasing after her. The storm greeted them with a fury that left no time for hesitation. The rain fell in sheets, soaking them in seconds, the wind howling through the fields, ripping their clothes and turning each step into a battle. Rachel pointed toward the cow, now tangled in the barbed wire at the far end of the property. "Get it out before it hurts itself," she screamed, her voice swallowed by the wind. Ethan didn't argue, moving with her toward the animal, muscles straining against the storm. As they got closer, the cow thrashed, its pained cries cutting through the rain like a desperate plea for help. Rachel arrived first, her hands working quickly to untie the rope. "Hold it steady," she called. Ethan moved next to the cow, gripping its reins tightly. The animal's strength was overwhelming, each movement a struggle as it resisted him. He braced his legs, digging his heels into the muddy ground, muscles aching as he fought to keep the cow in place. "Hurry up," he shouted, his voice hoarse from exertion. "I'm doing it," Rachel replied, her fingers fumbling as she untied the final knot. Finally, the cow broke free, stumbling a few steps before coming to a halt. Ethan released his grip, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The rain was pouring harder now, the storm showing no sign of letting up. Rachel grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the barn area. "Let's go," she urged. They ran together, the wind pushing them forward with each step. By the time they reached the barn, they were soaked to the bone, bodies shivering, faces caked with mud and rainwater. Rachel shut the door behind them and leaned against the wooden door, trying to catch her breath. Ethan collapsed onto a pile of straw, his heart pounding. "Tell me this is the worst of it, right?" he asked, his voice rough. Rachel glanced at him, her expression softening. "Sometimes it gets worse," she admitted, "but you did well." He looked at her, surprised by the unexpected compliment. "Thanks," he responded quietly. A while later, they sat in silence, the storm still howling outside. The air between them was heavy, but not with the tension from before. It was something else, unspoken but fragile. Betty's voice rang out from the house. "Rachel, Ethan, are you okay?" Rachel stood up, brushing the mud off her jeans. "We're fine," she shouted back, then glanced at Ethan. "You should go shower. I'll check on the animals." Ethan nodded, rising and heading toward the house. He couldn't stop glancing back at her, standing alone in the barn. The storm raged on, but for the first time since arriving, Ethan felt a slight sense of peace. He had faced the chaos and come through it, and though he wouldn't admit it, he knew Rachel was right. It wasn't just about surviving the storm, it was about finding your place in the calm that followed. The next morning, after the storm, the farm was immersed in a deceptive stillness. The fields were flooded, the land heavy, but the air was calm, almost tranquil. Ethan stood by the barn, surveying the damage. Broken branches scattered across the yard. One of the small buildings had lost part of its roof, tiles strewn across the grass. He ran his hand through his hair, still damp from the hasty shower earlier, his body sore from a sleepless night, every step a reminder of the chaos they'd endured. Rachel appeared from behind the house, walking decisively as always, ready to get to work, a cart full of tools and supplies trailing behind her. She glanced at Ethan but said nothing, her focus locked on the work ahead. Her silence was a stark contrast to the shouting and urgency of the night before, but it carried its own weight. "Not stopping for coffee?" Ethan called out, trying to lighten the mood. Rachel paused for a moment, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "The storm's over, but the work's not," she replied coolly. Ethan sighed and followed her to the damaged shed. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to help, whether it was leftover adrenaline from the storm or the vague respect he had begun to feel for her. Either way, he grabbed a hammer from the cart and started pulling nails from the broken tiles. For a long while, they worked in near silence, only the occasional sound of metal clinking and distant birdsong breaking the quiet. The sky had started to brighten, soft blue streaks cutting through the clouds. It should have been a peaceful moment, but Ethan sensed an undercurrent of tension, something unspoken smoldering between them. About last night? He began, glancing at Rachel from the corner of his eye. She didn't look up from her work. What about it? I just wanted to say thanks for trusting me. I know I didn't make the best impression when I first got here. Rachel looked up, meeting his eyes for a brief moment. She seemed ready to say something sharp, something that might sever the truce between them, but then she sighed and leaned against the cart. You handled it well, I'll admit, she said. Ethan felt an unexpected sense of pride at her words. That's high praise coming from you. Don't get too cocky, she said, but a faint smile played at the corners of her lips. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of an engine approaching from down the road. They both turned to see a dusty truck pull up near the house. The door opened and a tall man stepped out, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, broad shoulders and a confident stride immediately catching Ethan's attention. Jake, Rachel said, her voice calm, though there was something in it that Ethan couldn't quite place. Hey, Rachel, Jake responded, his tone warm and familiar. He glanced at Ethan, his expression shifting slightly. And you must be the new guy. Ethan felt an uncomfortable jolt run through him at the way Jake said it, but he extended his hand anyway. Ethan, he said. Jake shook his hand, the grip firm enough to be almost challenging. Jake Tully, family friend. There was something in the way he said it, a slight emphasis. That made Ethan feel like an outsider. He glanced at Rachel, who was observing the exchange with a neutral expression. What brings you by? Rachel asked, her voice cutting through the tension. Just checking in after the storm, Jake replied, his gaze lingering on Rachel for a moment before shifting back to Ethan. Making sure everything's all right. We're fine, Rachel answered. Quickly, the barn was still standing, and they had begun repairing the shed. Jake nodded, his eyes still fixed on Ethan. But can't let the city folks think life on the farm is too easy. Ethan tried to smile, but the discomfort swirling inside him was hard to mask. Trust me, I get that. Jake smirked, though there was no humor in it. If you need help, you know where to find me. Rachel nodded, her expression unreadable. Thanks, Jake. With that, Jake tipped his hat to them and climbed into the truck, the engine roaring to life as he drove off. Ethan watched him go, the awkwardness of the exchange leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Family friend, huh? He said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Rachel glanced at him, a warning in her eyes. Don't ask. I was just saying, Ethan continued, setting the hammer down. He doesn't seem too happy I'm here. Jake doesn't know you, Rachel replied, her voice sharp. And neither do I, so don't be so quick to judge. Ethan opened his mouth to retort, but then stopped. There was no point in arguing now. Instead, he picked up the hammer again and got back to work, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. By the time they finished the repairs, the sun was high, its warm light dispelling the last remnants of the storm's dampness. Betty appeared on the porch, waving them inside for lunch. The sight of a table filled with sandwiches and iced tea brought a sense of relief after the long morning. They sat under the shade of the porch, the tension easing somewhat as they ate. Betty chatted about the weather and the condition of the fields, her voice like a soothing balm, easing the remaining tension from their meeting with Jake. Ethan felt himself relax. The simple act of sharing a meal made him unexpectedly feel more grounded. As lunch came to an end, Betty excused herself to tend to the garden, leaving Ethan and Rachel alone. The silence between them stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally Ethan spoke, leaning back in his chair. Jake, he seems to protect everything. Rachel didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He's known this farm longer than you, she said after a pause. He cares about it, about us. We? Ethan asked, though he wasn't sure why he felt compelled to ask. Rachel's eyes flashed, her expression hardening. You don't have the right to ask questions like that. Ethan raised his hands defensively. All right, forget it. They sat in silence again, the unspoken words hanging between them like a heavy cloud. But as the afternoon wore on, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Jake's presence had stirred something that wouldn't be so easily ignored. As night fell, Ethan returned to the barn, organizing his tools, replaying the events of the day in his mind. The storm, the repairs, Jake, all felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite fit together. Rachel appeared at the door, her figure illuminated by the fading light of the evening. She stood there for a moment before stepping inside, her expression softer than before. "Thank you for your help today," she said quietly. Ethan looked up, surprised. "Thank you," she repeated, but then paused, turning back to him. Her voice dropped low, barely audible. "Jake isn't the problem, just remember that." And with that, she left, leaving Ethan alone with his mixed thoughts and the rising sense of unease in his chest. The air was thick, still, and uncomfortable, making him feel trapped. Ethan stepped outside, the screen door creaking shut behind him. He had barely started to adjust to the rhythm of farm life when a new complication arose. A shiny black car sat in the driveway, its polished exterior stark against the dusty surroundings. Leaning against it, arms crossed, was James Parker. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat, a feeling of suffocation spreading through him. His father's presence on the farm felt as out of place as the car. James didn't move, his gaze fixed on Ethan with an unblinking scrutiny, a look that had become synonymous with every confrontation between them. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his voice sharper than he intended. James straightened, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his suit. "I could ask you the same thing, but I suppose it's unnecessary." Ethan's jaw tightened as he took a step forward. "I'm doing what you asked, working, helping out, contributing here, aren't I?" James's expression remained unchanged. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you've learned." "I've learned this place doesn't need your interference," Ethan replied, the tension in his voice unmistakable. James's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Yet here I am. Let's go inside." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but the weight of his father's authority bore down on him, a pressure he still didn't know how to escape. He sighed, reluctantly gesturing toward the house and following James inside. The atmosphere between them was so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife as they entered the kitchen. Betty was sitting at the table, peeling potatoes, her gaze lifting in surprise and curiosity. Rachel stood at the counter, her back stiff, looking over her shoulder at them. The soft sound of the knife against the cutting board was the only noise in the room. James spoke first, his voice calm but carrying an edge of coldness. "Betty," he said, "what a surprise." Betty nodded politely in response. "It certainly is, James." Rachel turned to face them, her expression guarded. "What are you doing here?" James's eyes shifted to her, cold and assessing. "This isn't your concern." "Actually," James said, his tone even as he sat down at the table, "it's my business." Ethan felt the tension mount, each of James's words adding to the knot of anxiety that had been growing in him since his arrival. He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Get to the point, that. Why are you really here?" James's gaze flickered over Ethan, his eyes holding something Ethan couldn't quite decipher. "I'm here to give you a reminder, something I think all of you will feel relieved to hear." Betty put the knife down, folding her hands in her lap. "We're listening." James didn't rush, each movement deliberate. He slowly reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, placing it on the table. His fingers hovered over the edge of the paper. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is the agreement Rachel signed, the one that brought you here." The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan sat up straight, his hands hanging at his sides, a chill running down his spine. "What agreement?" Rachel froze, her eyes quickly darting to the paper. She didn't look at James, but her voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do this." James ignored her, pushing the paper toward Ethan. "Read it." Ethan hesitated, his stomach twisting as a wave of discomfort washed over him. He reached out, taking the paper, and slowly unfolded it. The neatly printed words blurred in his vision as he tried to focus. But the meaning hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. It was all there, clear as day, the agreement between James Parker and Rachel Thompson, financial support for the farm, in exchange for Rachel's agreement to marry James's son. Ethan's stomach knotted, and he set the paper down on the table, his hands trembling. "You knew," he said, his voice barely audible, almost a whisper. He turned to Rachel, his eyes full of hurt and disbelief. "You knew about this from the start?" Rachel stepped closer, her hands raised in a defensive gesture. "Ethan, it's not what you think." "Not what I think?" Ethan's voice rose, disbelief evident. "You agreed to marry me for a deal, for money, because I had no choice." Rachel immediately reacted, her voice choking. "The farm was on the brink of bankruptcy, my family was losing everything. What was I supposed to do?" Ethan's chest heaved as he struggled to process her words, but the pain was overwhelming. "You could have told me. You could have been honest with me." Rachel's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't look away. "So what would you have done, Ethan? Would you have walked away and left us to handle this ourselves?" Ethan stood motionless, his fists clenched, her words choking him. "I don't know," he said, his voice bitter. "But at least I won't be the last to know." The room fell silent, the only sound being James rising from his chair. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, his face unreadable. "They've said everything, now it's up to you to decide what comes next." Ethan turned around, his voice cold. "What are you doing here? To pour more fuel on the fire?" James' gaze met his, calm and unwavering. "I'm here to make sure you understand how important this is. This isn't just about you, Ethan. It never was." With those words, James left, the screen door closing softly behind him. Ethan stood still, his mind spinning, the weight of his emotions bearing down on him, threatening to bring him to his knees. Rachel stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Ethan, please don't," he shouted, his fists clenched. "Don't." He turned and walked away, slamming the door behind him. Outside, the cool air did nothing to soothe the fire burning inside him. He wandered aimlessly, his mind a whirl of anger, hurt, and confusion. When he reached the edge of the field, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. He stood there, eyes fixed on the horizon, trying to make sense of it all. But no matter how hard he tried, the betrayal was too deep, too painful. Back inside the house, Rachel stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold together the crumbling world around her. Betty approached, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He'll be fine," Betty said softly. "He just needs time." Rachel nodded, but her heart felt like it was shattering. "I hope so," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. As the last light of day faded, Ethan remained alone in the field. His thoughts spun wildly, like the storm that had driven him here in the first place. Everything had changed, and he didn't know what would be left when the storm finally passed. The night stretched on endlessly. The house, once filled with the sounds of work or conversation, now felt suffocatingly silent. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her hands tightly gripping a cup of tea, long cold, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Occasionally, her eyes would drift toward the door, hoping to see Ethan return, but the door remained shut, the darkness outside growing thicker by the minute. Betty quietly entered, the soft shuffle of her slippers on the floor the only sound. She placed a gentle hand on Rachel's shoulder, warm but unintrusive. "You should rest, dear. He'll come back when he's ready." Rachel shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the cup in her hands. "I can't. Not right now." Betty sighed, pulling up a chair to sit opposite her. "This isn't the first time someone's heart's been broken in this house. And it won't be the last. But the heart, it's a resilient thing, isn't it?" Rachel swallowed, her throat tight. "I never wanted to hurt him, that was never my intention." "Life doesn't go as planned, sweetie," Betty said gently, her eyes full of understanding. "You know that better than anyone." Rachel looked up, her eyes clouded with unshed tears. "I should have told him from the start, but I was afraid. Afraid he'd leave, afraid he wouldn't understand. And now I've just proven him right." Betty extended her hand, taking Rachel's in a comforting, firm grip. "You can't change what's been done, but you can decide what comes next. And maybe he needs to make that decision too." Rachel nodded slowly, the weight in her chest not easing one bit. Betty stood, moving slowly, then placed a gentle kiss on Rachel's forehead before returning to her room. Rachel sat in the kitchen, alone with her tumultuous thoughts. Silence enveloped her, pressing down on her. Outside in the field, Ethan stumbled, his footsteps leaving deep impressions in the damp earth. Each step was a mark, a trace behind him. The cold wind stung his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was full of thoughts of deals, lies, and the well-rehearsed drama. Everything was spinning, each thought sharper than the last. He stopped by the ancient oak tree at the edge of the land, its twisted branches reaching out as if to challenge the moonlit sky. He leaned back against the trunk, his body tense, trying to push away everything that gnawed at his mind. He stared out at the horizon, the vastness of the land bringing both a sense of peace and a heavy weight on his chest. The image of Rachel's face when he confronted her wouldn't leave his mind, her pained expression almost mirroring his own suffering, almost. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. Jake's figure emerged from the darkness, his presence like a storm that had just passed, unexpected, unwelcome. Ethan tensed, his shoulders slumping, his hands clenching at his sides. "Didn't expect to find you here," Jake said, his tone calm but sharp. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, neither did I think my life would turn into some soap opera, but here we are." Jake stepped closer, hands in his pockets. "You talk a lot, but you don't understand what you're walking into." Ethan's eyes darkened, frustration rising, his voice hardening. "I understand perfectly. I understand this is all just a play, a game." Jake shook his head, his teeth gritted. "This isn't a game for her. This farm, this family, it's her whole life. She's fought for years to keep it alive. You think she wanted to beg your father for help?" Ethan's voice cracked, the anger too much to hold in. "She didn't beg. She made a deal, and she didn't even tell me the truth." Jake responded, his gaze unwavering. "She didn't tell you because she knew you wouldn't stay. And from what I can see, she was right." Ethan's body stiffened, his hands clenched at his sides. The truth in Jake's words cut deep, like a knife through his heart. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth was too clear. He'd thought about leaving too. Jake moved closer, his voice low but strong. "You want to be angry with her? Fine. But don't pretend you're the innocent victim here. You have everything, and the first time you had to fight for something, you were ready to run." Ethan glared at him, his chest rising and falling as he fought to keep his emotions in check. "You don't understand me," Jake answered, his gaze unwavering. "But I understand her, and I know she deserves someone who won't walk away when things get hard." Jake's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He didn't wait for a response, turning and walking away, his figure fading into the darkness. Ethan stood there, his mind spinning, Jake's words clinging to him, refusing to let go. When Ethan returned to the house, the first rays of dawn were beginning to break over the horizon. He opened the door quietly, stepping in without wanting to wake anyone. But Rachel was waiting for him. She sat in the living room, curled up with her knees to her chest, her eyes red from hours of crying and exhaustion. She looked up when he entered, her face showing a mix of relief and worry. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them stretched like an abyss. "Can't sleep?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. Rachel shook her head. "I've been waiting for you." Ethan leaned against the wall, his body heavy, his gaze fixed ahead, unsure of where to begin. He crossed his arms over his chest, standing silently, staring at Rachel. She spoke in a steady tone, though there was an unmistakable tremor in her voice. "I need to tell you the truth." He didn't move, not a word escaped his lips. He simply stood there, silent, his eyes never leaving her, as if waiting for her to continue. Rachel took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the sofa, her body slightly trembling. "I didn't want to make that deal. Asking for help from your father was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I was desperate. This farm is more than just land, it's my family's history, our legacy. Losing it means losing everything. Her voice faltered for a moment, but she pressed on. When he made the offer, I thought I could handle it. I thought it was just business. But then you showed up, and everything became complicated. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his gaze still fixed on her, as if waiting for more. I want to tell you the truth, Rachel continued, her voice barely above a whisper, enough only for him to hear. But every time I try, I'm scared. Scared of how you'll react, scared that you'll leave me, scared that everything I've fought for will crumble. Ethan sighed, his hand running through his hair, his eyes closing as though trying to push away the tension in his mind. Rachel looked up, her gaze so strong and sincere that he could feel his heart tighten. Now I can't hide it anymore. You deserve to know the truth. Whatever happens next, the decision is yours. The air in the room grew thick. Ethan turned his face away, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, hurt, confusion, but also something else. A feeling he couldn't name. Finally he spoke, his voice deep and steady. I need time. Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't stop. Take all the time you need. Ethan turned and headed up the stairs. His steps were slow, heavy, as if each one carried an unbearable weight. He closed the door behind him, leaning against it, his chest tightening under the weight of what he had just heard. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do, and that terrified him. The early morning air was cool, but the streaks of light on the horizon signaled that a hot day was on its way. Ethan stood at the edge of the field, his boots sinking into the earth, as if each step reminded him of the long hours he had spent on this land. The farm had become a tether, binding him to a life he didn't want, yet couldn't escape. And today, that feeling was stronger than ever. The conversation with Rachel from the night before still weighed heavily on his chest, like a rock he couldn't lift. Betty's voice broke the stillness, warm and steady. Ethan, the harvest won't wait. Let's grab some breakfast and get started. He turned around, nodding slightly. I'll be right in. She gave him an understanding look, then turned and walked into the house. Ethan paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the field. It was beautiful in a way he was only just beginning to appreciate. He slipped his hands into his pockets, took a deep breath, and walked into the house. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was calm, with the soft sounds of preparations being made. Betty moved between the kitchen and counter, her movements quick and practiced. Rachel sat at the table, her hair loosely braided, her eyes still red from crying and exhaustion. Rachel's eyes were fixed on the coffee cup in her hands, and she didn't look up when Ethan entered, but he could feel the tension radiating from her. Betty broke the silence, her voice gentle and even. We've got a long day ahead. The east field is ready for harvest, and the fences along the northern border need checking. We can't afford to lose any more livestock. Ethan sat down across from Rachel, words caught in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of their conversation hung on him like a stone in his chest. Instead of speaking, he reached for a piece of toast, his movements slow, almost mechanical. Betty, ever the peacemaker, continued speaking, filling the silence with a stream of updates on farm work. Ethan half listened, his mind swirling with thoughts of what was to come. The heavy work ahead might serve as a good distraction, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to calm the storm inside him. When breakfast ended, the three of them stepped outside, the heat of the day already setting in. Rachel grabbed her gloves and walked toward the tractor without a word. Ethan hesitated, his gaze following her. Betty placed a hand on his arm, a soft but firm touch. Give her time, she said quietly. And give yourself time too. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I'll help with the harvest. Betty smiled, her eyes filled with pride. Good. Let's get to work. The morning passed in a blur of sweat and dirt. Ethan worked alongside Betty in the east field. The repetitive motions of harvesting the strange crops oddly soothing. The sound of the tractor from a distance was a constant reminder of Rachel's presence, though she kept her distance, working in silence. By noon, the sun was fierce, Ethan's shirt sticking to his back, drenched in sweat. He wiped his brow and glanced toward the tractor, where Rachel was stacking the freshly harvested plants. Her movements were swift and focused, and he couldn't help but admire her determination, though it only highlighted the widening gap between them. When it was time for lunch, Ethan sat alone beneath the shade of an old oak tree. He leaned back against the trunk, his eyes watching the leaves gently sway in the breeze. He wasn't sure how long it had been when a voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Do you mind if I sit with you?" He looked up to see Rachel standing a little ways off, her gaze cautious but open. He nodded and shifted to make room. She sat beside him, the silence between them both comforting and heavy. After a while, Rachel spoke, her voice soft and gentle. "I want to thank you." He turned to look at her, his brow furrowing, confused. "Thank me for what?" "Thank you for staying," she replied, her eyes still on the horizon. "After everything, you could have left. Most people would have." Ethan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Most people don't have a father who makes it almost impossible to leave." Rachel's lips curved into a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes, which were still full of unspoken emotions. "You could have walked away from all of this, from me." He paused, his words slowly forming. "Maybe I wanted to, but something keeps pulling me back." She looked at him, searching his face. "So what's keeping you here now?" Ethan stared back into her eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know how to answer. The farm, the people, the work, it was all beginning to mean something to him in a way he couldn't explain. But the most important thing was her. The thought of walking away from Rachel, from everything they had built, no matter how fragile it was, felt like something impossible. "I don't know," he finally admitted, "but I'm not ready to leave." Rachel's shoulders relaxed, a slight sense of relief, easing the tension from her face. "I'm glad," she said simply. The moment hung between them, fragile but full of hope. Before any further words could be spoken, Betty's voice called from a distance, pulling them back into reality. Rachel stood first, brushing the dust off her jeans. "Back to work," she said, her tone softer than before. Ethan followed, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. For the first time since arriving here, he felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this place could become something more than just a punishment. The afternoon passed with the task of repairing the northern fences, a job that required coordination and patience. Ethan worked beside Rachel, their movements gradually becoming synchronized. They didn't speak much, but the silence no longer felt heavy with unspoken words. Instead, it was a quiet understanding, a step forward in mending the cracks that had once been there. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the fields, they finished the last stretch of the fence. Rachel stepped back, nodding in satisfaction as she surveyed the work. "It looks good," she said, her voice steady. Ethan leaned against the fence post, his arms crossed. "Not bad for a city guy, huh?" Rachel raised an eyebrow, but a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Don't let it get to your head." They stood there for a moment, the evening's tranquility enveloping them, the distant chirping of crickets blending with the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Ethan turned to look at Rachel, his gaze serious. "I meant what I said earlier," he said. "I'm not ready to leave, and I want to do this right, not just for the farm but for us." Rachel took a breath, her eyes searching his. For a moment, it seemed like she might protest, but then she nodded, her voice soft. "All right." It wasn't a grand declaration or a bold gesture, but it was enough. It was a beginning. As they walked back to the house together, their shoulders brushed lightly, and Ethan felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew that, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it together. The next morning, the dawn spread over the farm, a golden mist, the kind of morning that carried a sense of something special. The air was fresh and alive, with the gentle scent of grass and freshly tilled earth. Ethan stood at the edge of the porch, his gaze sweeping over the seemingly endless fields. This time, the farm no longer felt like a burden weighing him down. This place felt like something entirely different, a place where he could build something real. Behind him, the creak of the screen door signaled Rachel's arrival. She stepped outside, holding a cup of coffee, her hair loose, the morning light shining down. She didn't speak, just quietly stood beside him, and together, they took in the view. It had become their unspoken routine, these moments of silence before the demands of a new day took over. "You've been waking up early lately," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was warm, with a hint of teasing, but there was curiosity in it too. Ethan smiled faintly, his hand resting on the porch railing. "I guess I'm starting to understand how this place works." Rachel took a sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving him. "You've changed a lot. From someone who couldn't tell a rake from a shovel to now." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Thanks for not giving up on me, even when I probably deserved it." Rachel tilted her head, her gaze soft. "You're not the only one who's had to learn." Their moment was broken by the sound of a truck engine approaching from afar. Both turned, their relaxed expressions shifting to one of caution as the vehicle slowly came into view. This wasn't a truck they recognized, an old, bumpy, dust-covered one, with a familiar face behind the wheel, Jake. Rachel set her coffee cup down on the railing, her eyes filled with suspicion. What does he want now? Ethan tensed, his jaw clenching. There's only one way to find out. They watched as Jake got out of the truck, the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel. His face was unreadable, but his eyes flickered with something, maybe determination, or even regret. He walked toward the porch, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Good morning, Jake." His voice was raspy but not hostile. Rachel crossed her arms, her stance defensive. "Jake, what are you doing here?" "Worry about." Ethan smiled faintly, shaking his head. "It seems miracles still happen." Rachel smiled, but her expression quickly turned serious as her eyes met his. "There's still so much to address, about us, about this place." Ethan took her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. "We'll handle everything together." Rachel's gaze softened, and she nodded. "Together." The rest of the day passed in a mix of work and quiet conversations. They worked on the farm with a newfound ease, their camaraderie growing stronger with every hour. By evening, the fields were bathed in the warm golden light of the setting sun, and the air was alive with the chirping of crickets as they sat on the porch. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange. Ethan turned to Rachel, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've been wanting to ask you something." She raised an eyebrow, curiosity clearly written on her face. "What is it?" Ethan took a deep breath, slipping his hand into his pocket. His fingers closed around the small box he had carried with him for days, waiting for the right moment. He pulled it out, opened the box, revealing a simple, yet elegant ring. Rachel's breath caught, her eyes widening. "Ethan." He knelt before her, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I know this hasn't been easy for either of us, but I also know that I can't imagine my life without you. This farm, this life, I never thought I'd want it, but now it feels like home, because you're here. So, Rachel Thompson, will you marry me?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment she was silent, her hand covering her mouth. Then she let out a half-laugh, half-cry of joy. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." Ethan gently slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling slightly as he stood. She threw her arms around him tightly, as if the world around them had disappeared. The sky grew darker, but neither of them noticed. They had everything. They stood there, on the porch, and for the first time, Ethan Parker knew, without a doubt, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The farmhouse buzzed with a rare energy, the air filling every corner, even seeping into the creaky floorboards. Ethan stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, carefully arranging wildflowers in a glass jar. It wasn't a task he had ever imagined doing, but today he was making sure every detail of this day was perfect. The wildflowers weren't perfect, some stems crooked, a few petals torn, but their simplicity held a beauty of its own. Everything was just right. So real. Betty walked into the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour from the cake she had spent the morning baking. She paused, watching Ethan with a small, knowing smile. "You're taking this very seriously." Ethan glanced at her, smiling sheepishly. "If I mess this up, Rachel will never let me live it down." Betty chuckled softly, walking over to adjust a leaning flower. "She'll love it because you did it. Because it's you." Her words were gentle, but they carried an unspoken weight. Ethan nodded, pausing his work for a moment. I want this to be perfect for her. She doesn't need perfection, Betty said, her voice soft. She needs sincerity. And you, Ethan, you've become something real to her. That's what matters. Ethan swallowed, the lump in his throat making it hard to breathe, but he nodded before returning to his task. Betty gave his shoulder a reassuring pat before stepping back, her presence a steady anchor amidst the chaos of the outside. People were busy with preparations. Friends and neighbors were setting up lights, arranging chairs under the shade of the giant oak tree that had stood watch over the farm for generations. The warm golden light of the afternoon filtered through the leaves, casting intricate shadows on the ground. The scene felt like a dream, simple but full of magic. Ethan stepped outside, taking in the view before him. Jake was standing near the cow pen, helping unload tables and chairs from a truck. When their eyes met, Jake gave him a subtle nod. No words were needed, the tension between them had eased in recent weeks, replaced by a mutual respect. They didn't need to speak to acknowledge that. The unspoken understanding in the silence was enough. Rachel wasn't around, and Ethan's heart raced at the thought of her. She had insisted on keeping with tradition and staying out of sight until the ceremony began. He'd caught glimpses of her through the window, laughing and chatting with a few friends who were helping her get ready. The sound of her laughter filled him with warmth, a feeling he never thought he'd experience. As the final touches were completed, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Guests began to gather, their conversations forming a soft hum of anticipation. Ethan stood by the oak tree, his palms sweating despite the cool evening air. He adjusted his collar, glancing at Betty, who gave him an encouraging smile. The music began to play, a soft melody that seemed like a promise, drifting through the air. All eyes turned toward the sound, and Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her. Rachel emerged from the house, hand in hand with Betty. She wore a simple white dress, the hem flowing like water, each step light, lace flowers sparkling in the light, giving her an ethereal beauty. Her hair was loosely tied, a few strands falling softly around her face, and her eyes locked onto Ethan's, making him feel as if she was pulling him toward her, as though the world around them had ceased to exist. Time seemed to slow as she drew closer, each step full of meaning, every moment heavy with significance. Ethan's heart pounded so loudly he could hardly breathe. When Rachel finally reached him, Betty gently let go of her hand and stepped aside. Rachel smiled at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Hello," she whispered, her voice steady despite the emotions filling the air. "Hello," Ethan replied softly, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes were slightly misty. He took a deep breath, forcing a smile. "You're incredible." She laughed softly, her cheeks flushing. "You're not so bad yourself." The pastor began to speak, but Ethan barely heard him, all his attention on Rachel. He didn't need the formal words to understand the magnitude of this moment. But when the question, "Will you take this woman as your wife?" was asked, he felt the weight of the moment settle in his heart. "I do," he answered, his voice steady and clear. Rachel's gaze never left him, her smile brightening even more. "I do," she replied, her voice gentle but unwavering. The applause and cheers from the crowd washed over them like a wave, and their shared joy was amplified by the happiness of everyone around them. Ethan didn't wait for the pastor to finish, leaning toward Rachel and gently cupping her face, kissing her. The world around them seemed to vanish. As they pulled apart, the applause and laughter echoed all around them. Betty wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron, and Jake clapped loudly, wearing a wide grin. Ethan and Rachel turned to face their friends and family, their hands still tightly entwined. The rest of the evening felt like a dream, the laughter, the dancing, the stories shared under the twinkling lights. Ethan was pulled in every direction, neighbors shaking his hand, friends patting him on the back, Betty insisting he try her cake before it was all gone. But no matter where he went, his eyes always found Rachel. She was the center of everything, her joy radiating outward, drawing everyone in. As the night grew late and the crowd began to disperse, only a few close friends and family remained. Ethan and Rachel sat under the oak tree, their hands still entwined. The farm stretched out before them, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. Ethan glanced at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and gratitude. "So, Mrs. Parker," he teased in a low voice, "how does it feel?" Rachel laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Strange, wonderful, like the beginning of something good." He kissed the top of her head, his heart full of happiness. "Yes, it's the beginning of everything." They sat in silence, the cool night air wrapping around them. The future was still uncertain, as it always had been, but for the first time, Ethan didn't feel afraid. He had Rachel, the farm, and a purpose he never thought he needed. And as the stars shone above, he realized that this life, this love, was more than he had ever dared to dream. This story is not just about love and change, but about the journey of finding meaning in life. Ethan learned that sometimes, the biggest steps come from the smallest decisions. Have you ever stood at a crossroads in life, choosing between what's easy and what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice could be a source of inspiration for someone else looking for direction. If this story touched your heart, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and family to spread the message of change and true love. Thank you for joining in this journey. Remember, even the smallest change can create miracles. Wishing you always find joy and purpose in life. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding.